Welcome back to Rethinking Community. I'm Zerlina Maxwell. I'm the MC. I'm the Director of Progressive Programming at SiriusXM Satellite Radio, and I am going to be your MC for this entire day here. We have already had very provocative and thought-provoking conversations this morning. I'm just reflecting on a news story that just broke, which I think is relevant to the conversations we're having today. We mentioned earlier that at the University of Florida, Richard Spencer spoke on campus, rented a building and spoke on campus. 3 people that attended his speech then left the speech and went outside and tried to shoot and kill a protester and were just arrested. So that I think is a relevant breaking news story that just happened. And I think as we engage on these issues about safe spaces and free speech, we always must remember that it's not necessarily always a theoretical conversation, that a lot of times there is real violence, and we're seeing that in the world right now. Like this is not only a conversation where we're having an intellectual debate about it. There are people behaving violently in the real world that we're living in. So I just wanted everybody to sort of reflect on that because it just broke in the news a few minutes ago. Now we're going to go and move into our keynote address. But before we do, I want to remind everyone again about the live streaming links and a few highlights that are going to be posted this afternoon. This session, just like all the other sessions, are going to be live streamed. You can go to livestream.com/WFU/rethink. And we're partnering with the Century Foundation to live stream and archive this conference. So all of the panels and keynotes will be available on the Century Foundation live stream, which is tcf.org/content/event/rethinking-community. And any sessions not available on the live stream, 3 of the 4 panels were not live streamed earlier this morning, but they're all going to be archived on that website. We welcome comments, questions, updates, and thoughts. Please share your photos, live tweet this session using the hashtags WFURethink, hashtag community is, and hashtag is community. Also, people are using hashtag rethinking community as the title of the conference to curate their thoughts and comments as we go throughout the day. Later this evening, there's a 2-hour dinner break before the evening sports and community panel, which I think is going to be really lively given the relevance to the current events and the news with the NFL and the debate over kneeling for the national anthem. We encourage you to support the restaurants who are partnering with Rethinking Community Conference by donating a portion of their receipts to the Second Harvest Food Bank of Northwest North Carolina. And to help support their work, they're feeding the hungry in 18 counties here in North Carolina, which is critically important. Menus of those establishments are available in your conference swag bag, which you should have gotten in the hallway, so check that out and make sure to support those establishments. Finally, when we reconvene after the dinner break tonight, it will not be here in this building. We will come together in the iconic Wake Chapel, here on the main campus. We will hear from our panel discussing issues of sports and community at a time when those issues, like I said, have taken a center stage in our national political discourse. Please come back for what promises to be a timely and important conversation. Right now, we want to turn over to our keynote address. To introduce the conversation, I want to bring back Melissa Harris-Perry, the Maya Angelou Presidential Chair and the Faculty Director of the I can't say this word every time I try it. I practiced so hard too. I said it so well yesterday. PHI Institute here at Wake Forest University. I really did practice that yesterday, and I was like, I nailed it, and as soon as I'm up here, Melissa, welcome back. Great.
Thank you all so much. This is a panel that I've been very much looking forward to. I want to be very brief here and simply say that, as I said this morning, tomorrow on Saturday, Professor Diner is setting, in many ways, the conversation that we are going to have during the day on Saturday. On Saturday, we are going to talk about a fundamental division, complication, struggle that many universities have the challenge of coping with. That is the question of the relationship between universities and their city, universities and their community. Professor Diner's work began with questioning and examining the history, the relationship between a key city, the city of Chicago, and its universities. I've spent much of the day reconnecting with my friend and colleague, Jacob Levy, as we have talked about our time as junior faculty at the University of Chicago, thinking about the role of the University of Chicago, the upstart university that Professor Diner wrote about in his first book, in which he thinks about the ways in which the University of Chicago, Mr. Harper's upstart university at the turn of the 20th century, begins to not only challenge the East Coast Ivies for intellectual and scholarly dominance, but also questions the very role that a university should have, taking on the question of education, public policy, international politics, and actually saying that universities should have a role with their cities. His most recent book in 2017, riffing on that same question, asks about the ways in which cities ought to be impacting, in fact, universities themselves, asking about the ways in which, in the work that he did for all of his years as chancellor at the university, at Rutgers University-Newark, and in each of those years at Rutgers University-Newark, Professor Diner, at the time, Chancellor Diner, during each of those years, I'm sorry, I have all of this written, but it is not on the particular laptop on which I'm looking, so I'm trying to remember it all from my memory. Professor Diner made the University of Rutgers-Newark the #1 university for racial and ethnic diversity, according to U.S. News and World Report. My staff and team at PHI knows that this makes Professor Diner basically my hero, in part because I have long hoped to somehow find a way to infiltrate U.S. News and World Report, and particularly the way that they rank colleges and universities, changing somehow college rankings so that the importance of things like food, football stadiums, and freshman dorms would become less relevant, and things like graduation rates of first-year students and college diversity and campus diversity would become more important. Professor Diner is joined in this conversation by Colleen Flaherty, who is a reporter, a staff reporter at Inside Higher Education. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks for having us. I just wanted to start, obviously, with the question of community. I think community is a word that gets used a lot in higher education, and frequently in ways that take for granted we all know what it means. For example, presidents and provosts often write all campus memos to a campus community. But at Inside Higher Ed, we actually don't use that word very much because often it implies more of a community of interest between members of a group than may actually exist, such as when it's used to talk about members of a disciplinary community or members of an ethnic group or a particular sexual orientation. So we're always sort of scrambling to come up with synonyms for the word, I guess, when we're trying to translate these things that we're talking about. And so I would ask Professor Diner in his comments to maybe give what he thinks is a good, true working definition of community or communities, and then talk about what the responsibility of the university is these days to the community on campus and off. And obviously this is your time to talk about exactly what you want to talk about, but I have a feeling you'll probably at least implicitly address those questions anyway.
Okay, is this on? Yeah, okay. As you just heard, I just recently published this history of the relationship of universities and cities, and I am a historian. Yes, I ran a university, but I am a historian, and my work was mostly about the past, although obviously historians like to think that the past illuminates the present. But let me, I'm going to try to summarize some of the key findings in my book. And so with regard to community, I have addressed the issue of community in two ways. One is how higher educators, particularly in cities, viewed the nature of the campus as a community and how that community experience was to shape the education of students. The other part is the relationship of campuses in cities to their surrounding community, and to the cities. So let me begin by pointing out that when I got into this research, one of the things I discovered is that the history of American higher education is profoundly anti-urban. The view was widely believed that college was a place to build character in young men, and you couldn't build character in cities because cities were evil and had all kinds of bad influences. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. Lewis Dunn, a minister who wrote about higher education in 1876, wrote, colleges located in quiet rural towns do accomplish more work and better work than in other localities. And large cities, business centers, places where people congregate should never be chosen as a location for a college. Now, the thinking is, you got a nice compact campus, then you create a student community and you influence students. But they also believe that the way to build character in young men is to put them close to nature. That being near a tree would help. Another example, 1883, another minister, very involved in education, wrote a book on American colleges, and he had a chapter called Morals. And he said a significant number of city-bred students are immoral on their entering college because the city environment has, for many of them, been excellent preparatory schools for sophomoric dissipation. And even home influences have failed to outweigh the evil attractions of the gambling table and its accessories. He said, in contrast, students from rural settings have been deeply elevated not only by the purity of the student's home, but the associations of his country life. And one more example of this, these two you probably never heard of, but the next person was a university president and then president of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. He was president of Princeton. And Woodrow Wilson wrote, colleges should promote liberal culture for a select group of men capable of appreciating moral, intellectual, and aesthetic values. The education prepares them for national service and civic leadership, but is not appropriate for the majority who carry forward the common labor of the world. This could be accomplished only in compact and homogeneous residential colleges. You cannot go to college on a streetcar and know what college means. So that's Woodrow Wilson. And this was reflected in, in all kinds of ways. There were, of course, a variety of prominent colleges that began in cities, Columbia, Penn, for example, and others. But their history is also very interesting. Columbia moved 3 times to escape the city. So did Penn. And when Columbia finally built its Morningside Heights campus, they realized sooner or later the city will always catch up with us, so we can't keep moving. So we'll build a wall around the campus and plant lots of trees. Penn did something similar. And my favorite example is NYU. NYU was a downtown, not terribly selective campus serving local people. But in 1880, the president of NYU decided we have to have a really elite undergraduate college, and we can't have it in New York City. So they purchased a large plot of land along the Hudson River in the countryside, now called the Bronx. And they built this Gothic campus and all the rest, and you know, that's where they built their undergraduate program until the 1970s. And then they decided the Bronx wasn't the best place to attract top students and so on. Land-grant universities, you know, it's a big federal legislation, almost entirely located in small towns and rural areas. Really only the University of Minnesota was in a city, and that was a city of 15,000 people at the time, and so on. Now, there was an exception. It was widely believed that professional schools should be located in cities, and so, you know, law schools and medical schools develop simultaneous with undergraduate liberal arts schools, and for a long time you didn't need a college degree to go to a law school or a medical school. And so those did develop in cities because the idea was, well, cities have hospitals, they have law firms, government agencies, and the like. Now, one other thing that developed in the 19th century initially were what were called municipal universities. Municipal universities were universities funded by city governments and providing education for the people who live in the city, which meant by definition 100% of the students would commute, and they'd all be local students. And this in turn created tensions in higher, you know, for the leaders of these institutions in terms of, well, what do we do, you know, given their commuters, and how do we build character in such young people? So what emerged, in 1914, there was an organization called the Association of Urban Universities. It was founded, and its leaders got together at least once a year, and they shared experiences and, you know, ideas about, well, what do we do about educating students in cities? So I'll give you a couple of examples of the way in which they talked about that. There was a dean at Tufts College who wrote that his institution had once been rural, but now drew most of its students from Boston and other nearby cities. He said, although students who came to Tufts in the early days, quote, came from rustic families, they had a background of ideals very different from those of students who come to us today. Current students, he observed, come from the lower classes, not what we would call the lower classes, and they are naturally people without background, and they lack imagination. Therefore, although they can apprehend a fact perfectly well, they have nothing at home, and I fear very little in the schools to prepare them for actual literary work. So this is the dilemma. How do you deal with these students? So that's one example. The chancellor of, I'm sorry, lost my place here. Another example of this concern about students, you know, is the dean of freshmen at Brown University. And he wrote in the early 20th century, he was worried that his institution, quote, in common with other institutions located in a like environment, has in her student body too large a proportion of socially undesirable students. Emphatically denying that he was Jew baiting, which is exactly what he was doing, he expressed grave concern about the influx of alien blood into what was not so long ago a homogeneous group of students, prevailingly Baptist and Anglo-Saxon. He went on to say this social background would make college education, or students in college, would make their training in college of little value to society because they couldn't become the civic leaders that, that he had wanted. So this was the predominant view in the private institutions, but also, more importantly, in the commuter, public, municipal universities. So the president of Hunter College, right after he left office in 1946, he described the, when he left office in 1961, he described the frustrations of educating these women at Hunter College. And he said, when he assumed the leadership of the college, quote, a large number of the girls who came to Hunter had absorbed a variety of prejudices from home environments, displayed only the rudiments of good manners, spoke English atrociously, and had as little use for honor societies as they did for Herbert Hoover. And he went on to say, these students, mostly daughters of Jewish immigrants, were, quote, raucous, gawky, afflicted with acne, halitosis, and deplorable hairdos. And this is a public university, you know. Okay, now this begins to change somewhat. By the 1960s, it begins to change. And after World War II, there's, of course, great expansion of higher education in cities. Well, there's great expansion of higher education in America, and most of the new institutions were in cities. And so there's tremendous growth of that sort of thing. So by the 60s, there isn't the same sort of blatantly critical attacks on students, but there's still, particularly with the rise of open enrollment, allowing anyone who graduates high school to get into a college. With the rise of open enrollments, many just complained that, students were just poorly prepared and unable to move ahead. Well, let me move on quickly to another interesting dimension of all of this. Throughout the 20th century, there has been a continuing argument and debate about what it meant to be an urban university. The Association of Urban Universities was founded in 1914, and at that point, the association brought together people who were at urban universities, and they argued about this, and they began the discussion of the kinds of things we're talking about at this conference. So, for example, Samuel Capon, the Chancellor of the University of Buffalo, in 1946 said, he gave a speech, the term urban university designates something other than the mere accident of location. It has a special obligation to be hospitable to all local requests for those intellectual services which a university may legitimately render. So, the idea, urban university means a university connected to the city. Many people started arguing in the 60s that to be an urban university, you had to educate a majority of your students from the local area. If you had students from all over, you weren't an urban university. In 1978, the Ford Foundation started a program of grants to urban higher education. And to be eligible for a Ford grant, you had to be committed to primarily educating local students, which typically meant commuter students and so on. So given this whole background, so to speak, how did these institutions relate to their cities? Well, one way is by addressing the needs of city government. It's not that they plunged into that all at once, and not every institution in a city did that. But very early on, in the pre-World War II period, training programs were developed by universities and cities, usually at the request of the city government, for city employees. How do we educate these folks who work in the city, don't know anything about the jobs they're doing? How do we educate them properly? And out of that grew the field of public administration. Public administration grew out of the efforts of universities to provide some of the needs for cities. Public school teachers also, that's not surprising, but lots and lots of programs were started on how to educate public school teachers in cities. In 1967, HUD commissioned the National Academy of Sciences to report for a report on urban research and how urban research could be used to address the problems of cities that were emerging or that were very prominent in the late 60s. And then the year later, HUD contracted with the National League of Cities to create a program called Urban Observatories. And the urban observatories were funded research centers in a bunch of cities at universities to bring in data and study the nature of the issues and the populations in cities. And this continued for a while, but then HUD ran out of money and wouldn't fund it, and they figured, oh, it'll go on its own, and of course they all collapsed. But another dimension is the continuing discussion about the role of urban universities or universities in cities in economic development. And all kinds of universities and cities acquired property, tried to transform their neighborhoods. University of Chicago is a classic case of that, essentially kicking out poorer people, minorities, so that your neighborhood's more attractive. And this issue has gone on, for most of the, certainly since World War II, as one urban institution after another expands and is concerned about either the deterioration of its surrounding neighborhood or how to upgrade the surrounding neighborhood. This has become a major issue. In recent years, there has been serious efforts to bring together the universities and community leaders, people, local community entities, so that kind of highly polarized activities of universities that were so classic. Columbia was another one in the 1968 sit-in by students at Columbia, was largely about the university taking over land in Harlem and kicking out black people and so on. That became increasingly important. And in 1994, HUD created something called the Community Outreach Partnership Center. And its purpose was, quote, to address local housing, economic development, and neighborhood revitalization needs and to insist consortia in large-scale community building. But consortia was key here. You know, there's not just the universities that would do this. And then in 2009, something called the Anchor Institutions Task Force was created, and this grew out of the idea, well, what's the economy of cities like? You know, the future of cities. And so, well, the economy, the future of cities depends upon, you know, major institutions that will attract other kinds of businesses, and universities, hospitals in particular. And the idea being, well, you got strong universities there, then you'll attract all these other knowledge-based companies to locate in the city and build, and this will bring about the revitalization of the city. So that organization was created 10 years ago. And then finally, I'm wrapping up. Finally, one of the issues that continued in universities and cities from the beginning was student engagement. Since the students are in this university, what relationship should they have to the city? And as early as 1904, the University of Cincinnati created the first cooperative learning program in America, you know, where students spend significant periods of time in community internships. By 1920, 10 universities offered co-op learning. By 1960, 61 institutions did. And by 1973, 600 institutions did. There was also the creation of something called the National Society for Experiential Education, because again, you know, getting involved in real life became increasingly important in the view of education. 1985, Campus Compact was founded, and this is an entity whose purpose is, you know, we want to build character in young people by getting them to do volunteer service in the community, because how else are we going to have civic leaders in the future? And in 1990, Congress created something called the Commission on National Community Service, which was later renamed Corporation for National Community Service. Okay. So I'd say just very quickly, everything I described about the negative view of cities changed by around 2000. For various reasons, one thing, cities became, quote, less dangerous, more attractive, there was urban development, but more and more students who had choice about college were choosing to go to colleges in cities, not in the countryside. And these rural colleges were suffering significant enrollment loss. And there are a couple of reasons for this, I think two in particular. One, that all these students growing up in homogeneous, low-density suburbs now found the city an exciting place to be in its own right, but also because they want to get jobs. And while you can do internships anywhere, I suppose, the opportunities for such things are vastly greater in the city. So anyhow, to sum up, and I know I've talked too long, but to sum up, the things that happened in urban universities, or universities in cities, the engagement with the city in terms of research, the engagement of the city in terms of teaching, and the whole range of the kinds of things that we talk about today, experiential learning and all of that. This all began in cities, and then it became part of all of American higher education. But even though cities were the minority in the 19th century and were considered exceptional, today what has happened historically in cities has really transformed, I'd say, all of higher education. So,
Great.
thank you.
Okay. Well, I had a question that I wanted to ask you first, but
Okay.
I'm going to put that on pause because what you said reminded me of something that I've come across in my work recently. You mentioned that urban universities originally, less so over time, and I feel like maybe increasingly again now, are trying to solve, some of them, enrollment crises by focusing again on this pre-professional kind of education. And in some cases, that has come at least from certain professors' view, the expense of the liberal arts mission that these universities had adopted over time. Long Island University, for example, has cut a number of traditional liberal arts majors in recent years, while they've invested heavily in nursing and things like that to try to get their enrollment up. But the faculty is not happy about it. So how should the modern urban university, including ones that are struggling with enrollment, try to balance that pre-professional and sort of, and community, I guess, community focus in terms of training professionals who are going to work in the community eventually with the liberal arts mission that a lot of them are based on?
Well, I can answer that from my own experience, not based on the research.
Right.
But I think there are a number of things. First of all, because of what I described, when I was chancellor of Rutgers Newark, I came in and some faculty thought I was crazy. I said, we should advertise Newark as a great way to get an education. Look at all the, all the experiential things you could do. And in fact, we have done that, and it's become increasingly important. But every institution, I think, in the country, not every, but most institutions in the country that have a mix of liberal arts and professional programs are expanding the professional programs, and particularly business. In my institution, it's just every year, it seems like a larger and larger portion of students major in business. And that's because they're worried about money and they want to get a job when they get out. Now, I did something I'm very proud of. We redid our general education requirements. And the general education requirements had typically been 60-plus hours with 8 hours in literature and 8 in social science, and et cetera, et cetera. And I encouraged and worked with a task force to completely redo those and reduce the core requirements to 30 hours and require every student to do 2 majors. And, this was the key, the business school offered 6 different majors, but you could only take 1 business major, which meant if you were studying business, you had to take something else. Now, some of them just took economics, figuring it's an extension of business, but even that is not the case. But many of them took lots of other things, and many students told me how exciting it was to be able to study literature or philosophy or history. Now, I'm not saying that's a formula for everybody, but that's a way to do it. I should also add that the struggle between liberal arts and vocational education is very long-standing. And the arts and science faculty have never liked the idea of schools developing undergraduate professional programs. And the administration has almost always said, well, we have to do this because how are we going to serve students? And, and this continuing argument about can you really get both a liberal and professional education? And what do you gain and what do you lose?
Do you think maybe it's a false argument? Are there ways of doing both?
I think there are, yes. Yeah, I definitely do. I think, for example, if you're going to major in business or you're going to major in nursing or whatever, there are important reasons for you to not only learn certain techniques, but to have a broader view of organizational behavior, the larger culture, how does business fit into it, the larger economy. And by the way, when we started this dual major requirement, I talked with a couple of CEOs of major corporations in Newark and told them about it, and they were very positive. they said business today is not generic. Every business, you got to know something in general about business, but you also have to know about the particular product industry that you're dealing with. And they said having to do both a business and a liberal arts major will better prepare students. Now, I don't know if that's universally held, but this is what they told me.
Okay. I've heard some business leaders say the same, so.
Yeah. Oh, good.
Okay. Well, now, switching gears dramatically, if you don't mind,
No,
just to
not at
start
all.
with a bit of news, Richard Spencer, obviously the white nationalist, was at the University of Florida yesterday, causing significant strain on the campus community and the surrounding area in Gainesville. The University of Florida basically said, we are going to let him come rather than face legal challenges. It's my understanding that, as a public school, they are subject to the First Amendment, and then they also have a specific policy about not prohibiting speakers. But I wanted to see if you thought that that was the right choice.
I do, yes.
Yeah,
I do, absolutely.
yeah,
I've always believed that the remedy for offensive speech is more speech, and that one way you deal with this kind of thing. So if we can have this racist come, then organize a group of forums on campus for students. Have students organize it, in which you talk about racism, its history, how do we address it, how do we deal with it. I think that's very, very important. And I did that around a few issues also, when I was chancellor. But I think you shouldn't just ignore it. I think you should use it as a mean, not to ban these speakers, but as a means of serious discussion, either in class or outside of class, or both.
right, okay.
That's my view.
So actually, to mix things up a little bit, some people that I talked to for work this week, I mentioned that I was coming here, and I asked them I asked a few of them to tell me what they'd like to ask you, and so this is a related point,
Great.
actually, from Jeffrey Stone, a First Amendment scholar at the University of Chicago and chair of its Committee on Freedom of Expression, which wrote a free speech policy that has now been
Yes.
adopted by many other institutions.
Yes.
And he is, I think, what we would call a First Amendment purist, right? But he said, students today often say that they think of their university as their home and that they should not have to confront in their home hateful ideas that make them feel unwelcome, marginalized, and afraid. What do you think of this, and how does it relate to your conception of community?
Well, what I think of it is, it's not their home in the most traditional sense. But there are probably a not insignificant number of students who hold political views radically at odds with their parents' political views, and argue and fight about that. So, I don't. But much more important, I don't think it's a matter of home. I think, students have to be exposed to points of view that are different than their own and learn from it. In many ways, you could say that having these disparities over political issues makes it more of a home because it creates an opportunity for dialogue and discussion. Now, I know that can get very nasty and all of that, but ideally, it should be an opportunity for exchange of ideas and for learning.
Right. I've heard some people who hold that view sort of call what we're seeing on a lot of campuses these days in terms of free speech a crisis.
Yeah.
Would you go that far? Or do you
Yeah.
think, yeah?
I do think it's a crisis. I think it's very unfortunate to me that students today on the left and the right have taken the posture of, well, we're going to, demonstrating against a speaker, I have no problem with. But trying to ban that speaker, I have great problems with. And I think that's a very unfortunate thing. All kinds of people speak on campuses, and you're gonna like some of them and hate some of them. When I was in college, there was somebody who spoke on my campus who was a very, very strong supporter of Barry Goldwater. And, we were all mostly liberal kids, and, we were appalled. But I was editor of the college newspaper, so I wrote a whole editorial about why this guy was wrong and all the things that he said that were wrong, and, went on from there. That's the way I would like it to be, but it's not that way now.
Well, turning now to immigration and some of the debates around DACA and undocumented students.
Yes.
I was talking to a chancellor of an unnamed campus earlier this year, and when President Trump's initial travel ban came out, he put out a letter to the campus community strongly condemning it. And he's a communications scholar, and he was very surprised to get a lot of blowback from both students and the surrounding community in Wisconsin, saying that you don't speak for me. And he actually had to, or thought it was appropriate to go back and revise his statement to say that he was speaking for himself and some people he knew of on campus. However, he recognizes that there are, different views out there. So I just wanted to ask you what you thought of the campus role, the university role in speaking out or not on immigration reform or lack thereof, travel bans, and maybe even the idea of sanctuary campuses.
Okay. Well, I'm very biased on this subject. 37% of our undergraduates come from homes where English is not the first language. 74% are either immigrants or children of immigrants. So there's no such controversy on my on my campus. But everybody talks about diversity, but diversity of all kinds, not just the kind that U.S. News measures that put my institution number one, because that's the gross categories of black, white, Asian, Hispanic, American Indian. But diversity of all kinds, including people with lots of different languages, different parts of the world, religion. Oh, by the way, my own campus, 12% of our undergraduates tell us their religion is Muslim, and 12% tell us their religion is Hindu. So I think that I not only think, I have seen firsthand as a professor what a learning opportunity it is to have so many different kinds of students in the class. They learn so much from each other. It's not that they, every Muslim student says, oh, I want to hang out with a Jewish student and talk about the Middle East. They may hang out in the cafeteria with their, quote, their own. And some people criticize the institution, say, well, you're not really achieving diversity because students of a similar religious or ethnic background hang out together in the cafeteria. I don't see that as a problem. They're together in classes, they're together in student organizations, and they learn from each other. One of the things, by the way, that I did as chancellor is I set up a professional development program for faculty on how do you use the diversity you have in the class as a teaching tool. And that may seem self-obvious, but it really isn't. There were a lot of faculty who were afraid to bring up anything involving religion or ethnicity, or they were afraid, well, you call on this one student. Oh, tell us what Muslims think. Tell us what Hindus think. Tell us what Jews think. And you certainly don't want them to do that. You don't want them to single out students and say, tell us about your background. But there are all kinds of ways of engaging students in which they will then come forward with their particular perspective. So we had a wonderful set of professional development sessions for faculty to strengthen their capacity to take advantage of the diversity we had in the classroom. The one other thing about U.S. News, I said I was very critical of it, but, they have, I once wrote to them, but they didn't respond. And I said, look, my institution's #1 in diversity, but diversity is integral to academic quality. So why is diversity measured separate from your academic rankings? And
It's interesting. Yeah.
they didn't want to hear it.
Cricket.
But I believe that very, very strongly. And not just racial and ethnic or religious diversity, class diversity also, and also having sexual orientation diversity.
Right. Well, I think we've established here that there's an imperative, if you're an urban university, to have your student body reflect to some degree the surrounding community. So I'd like to hear about your success story at Rutgers. How did you make it happen?
Okay, well, U.S. News had already ranked us the most diverse campus before I got there.
Yeah.
Okay, so I can't take credit for that. And it's also very interesting because in 1967, there were very, very few black students on the campus. It was a mostly white institution, and the black students who were there took over one of our buildings in a big sit-in. Got a lot of attention. And as a result of that, the university started a program of support for low-income students to enroll, at Rutgers Newark. And I wouldn't say that our rankings for diversity grow exclusively out of that, but that's certainly,
Was that a residential program?
What do you mean? To living on campus? No, at that point,
No.
we had almost no dormitories. Now we do. But when I got to the chancellor's position, one of the things I discovered pretty early on was we had relatively few students from Newark enrolled. Here we were in the middle of downtown Newark, but we had some, but not nearly as many as you would expect given the demographics. We had lots of, quote, black students, but we didn't have very many students who came from Newark. And so I started a couple of different programs, and my successor has continued with this even more aggressively. And one of the programs I started was we would get students enrolled on the campus who were from Newark, grew up in Newark, and we would pay them to go to every junior high school and every high school in Newark and talk to the students about enrolling in Newark. One of the things that I found baffling when I came was I was told that Newark high school students and Newark principals and teachers viewed Rutgers Newark as a white institution. I mean, we were hardly that, by the time I came, we quote, most diverse, but it was still seen as an institution that wasn't friendly to graduates of local public high schools in Newark. And so that's one of the reasons we sent out these students. And we started working very aggressively on that. We also started various partnerships with public schools so that we could do certain things jointly and get students onto the campus before they were in college. And then, one of the things I'm very proud of, I was able to get a $3 million endowment to enable low-income Newark residents to live on campus. We're not primarily residential, but we're growing, and more and more residential students. And some people said to me, why? The Newark students, they live 15 minutes away. They can get here quickly. But there's a whole difference between living on campus and being in college 24/7 or commuting. And in many of their cases, there was no place to study at home. It was small apartments, they were noisy. Parents would say, well, take your grandfather to the doctor, do this, do that. And I got a slew of letters or emails from students in this program who said, my grade point average has gone up dramatically. It went up from C to B because of this, and I can't thank you enough, and this has really made a huge difference. And I know we have to wrap up, but I'll tell you one final story. I'm on a task force. It's called the Newark Education Trust. It's an entity that tries to bring together all the elements and all the different types of people involved in educating Newark kids. So we had a session in which the new mayor of Newark, his recently appointed associate for public education came to this meeting. And he talked a bit, but first we went around the table, and we introduced ourselves. And somehow I had the sense that he was nodding at me as if he knew me. I didn't know him. Well, I went up to him afterwards and said, have we met before? She said, oh, of course. You started that program to let lower-income Newark students live on campus, and I was in the first group, and you met with us. That was very gratifying, I got to tell you. Okay.
Well,
I'm sorry for babbling
No.
on so much.
I have so many questions I could ask you, but maybe I can email you. So thank you so much.
Good at it?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I don't know, do we have time for questions? A few?
Okay.
So I think we have time for one or two questions. Yes.
So in one of the breakout sessions about safe spaces, a question kind of came up about the role of the university in protecting free speech and things like that. So my question to you is, in this kind of climate of racial turmoil right now, when hate groups come to demonstrate on campus, what is the role of the university to protecting kind of students and their presence of mind, and or does the university have a role in promoting the safety of those actual students?
Oh, the university definitely has a role in promoting safety, but it depends how and that's one of the things that's become so complicated. I don't think a university promotes safety by banning a speaker. But the university does have to have a sophisticated police force and security system, and if necessary, to clearly separate potentially violent protesters from the speaker.
One distinction that the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education has made is the university's responsibility towards students in terms of their physical safety, but not their intellectual comfort. And so that's a clear line for them. It's just one perspective.
Yeah, and I would add, intellectual discomfort is part of the education process.
Yeah.
You ought to be challenged by ideas that trouble you.
Or
Doesn't mean you have to
emotional
embrace
discomfort.
those ideas, but you ought to be aware of them and be able to address them.
Again, on freedom of speech, and particularly in urban universities where the amount of surrounding political life is substantial and complicated. How Hyde Parkish, in the British sense, is your view here that public universities are directly governed by the First Amendment doesn't mean that they are themselves open fora any more than government agencies that have office buildings are open fora. The university has an internal set of norms of academic freedom and viewpoint neutrality with respect to speakers and events that are sponsored on campus. But that's not the same as saying, well, just because we're in a city and there are lots of people around who are interested in saying things, that the university may not limit speaking access on campus to those speakers who have a sponsorship relationship with a bona fide on-campus organization. It sounded sometimes as if you were pushing toward a pretty Hyde Parkish view of the campus as an open space to all speech. Is that what you need to be doing?
If I could just say one thing first, just about Richard Spencer, I just want to kind of, since we did talk about that, he invited himself, so that kind of gets to your point. He was not an invited speaker. But again, just I think with the University of Florida, there is some specific policy prohibiting them from not allowing their buildings to be rented. But Texas A&M University does not have that policy, is also public, and did not allow him to come. It's just two examples.
Yeah, that rule isn't required by the First Amendment. It's
Yeah.
just Florida.
Right.
Well,
Yeah. 10,000 versus 500,000, right, for all the security.
no, it's a very good question. On my campus, and I certainly agreed with this, a speaker, you could not get use of a university facility for a speech or a program or whatever unless it was sponsored by an academic department, a unit, or a student group. Now, there are all kinds of student groups, and you can get 3 or 4 students, create some kind of student group, but no, we did not allow use. You couldn't rent the university facilities just for fun, or just randomly. There had to be a student sponsorship, or if you wanted to run a public event, community event or something like that on the campus, and it wasn't sponsored by a particular department, and we had, any number of those, then you had to get clearance from the chancellor. And I wasn't going to rent the facilities to the Nazi Party or whatever, but, lots of good community groups wanted to hold a forum and use the campus.
Anyone else?
There was some.
I'd like to know what you think about universities that are not as diverse in regarding to student and faculty populations, exploiting their diverse population of students on campus by intentionally putting pictures of diverse non-white students in advertisements when the diversity is really low in schools. And what do you think this reflects about their communities and how they function on campus?
Yeah,
not talking
obviously
about-
that's not something I've ever had to deal with, but I see a lot of that, not just in universities. There's all kinds of advertising that's very conscious about racial appearance, and wants to have a mix of this and this and this in order to get people to buy the product. It's an interesting question. I'm not quite sure how I feel about that. I think it's not, my gut instinct right now is it's not a bad thing. If, you want to attract larger numbers of underrepresented groups and you put a couple of them on your literature or brochures, I don't see any great harm in that. I don't think that's misrepresenting the campus. And besides, if a minority student wants to come to an institution that has a significant population of the same racial or ethnic background, they're going to find out what the population is. They're not going to be taken in by some photos on a brochure. So I don't think it's really misrepresenting